Welcome to Conversation for Exploration. Hi, host Laura Lee. Advancements in technology is continuing to change our world, and Nick Begich, who first told us about HARP, is back to talk about technologies of the new battlefield. They include non-lethal weapons and control systems for the environment and our weather, new underwater sonars, threats to privacy. We have a new coming surveillance society thanks to terrorism, and Nick says also that some of the same technological advancements that are being designed to depress the human spirit could also be used instead to enhance the human condition. Nick joins us from Anchorage, Alaska. Welcome back, Nick. How are you?
I'm great. It's good to be back with you again, Laura.
Technologies of the new battlefield. What is the new battlefield?
Well, it's a much different environment. I mean, I think we've seen sort of the inclinations that the battlefield now is essentially any place, any time, and anywhere. You know, the big changes in the past wars, predominantly the casualties were the military combatants, but in modern warfare, most of the casualties tend to be civilian populations, and that's a significant change in terms of warfare. Essentially, what's been recognized, particularly in the recent events in Afghanistan, is that conventional wars against the United States are not winnable by any third world country, that the only way to attack this country is with the kind of nonsense we saw on 9/11 and potentially even much more devastating approaches to warfare that are much more difficult to guard against. And I guess that's the big difference in the battle environment today as opposed to, say, a century ago or even less.
Speaking of terrorism, where do you stand on the give and take between surveillance so that terrorist activities are stopped before they happen and the rights that we enjoy in this country?
Well, this is a really important question. You know, this issue of surveillance and technologies and what the challenges of the modern era would unfold, we really spoke about a couple of years ago when we started writing on this subject, and our hope was that when we published Earth Rising that it would lead to a little more conscious legislation, because some of these technologies, while they may be fine to use against an adversary, in fact, absolutely could be used against an adversary effectively, and we support that. But the problem is much of this technology is being developed for joint use. In other words, there's a protocol between Department of Defense and Department of Justice to put priority funding on dual-use technologies, those that can be used against our declared enemies and those that can be used domestically against our own citizens. That causes me a little bit of concern. And then when you look at the acceleration of legislation that's giving more authority to organizations that even in the weeks before the events in New York, you know, the same agencies were being called on the carpet for incompetence, the FBI in particular, and yet now they've been given more money, more authority, and even less accountability. And that, I think, strikes at the very heart of trying to find that balance, is how do we hold our government accountable in uncertain times and yet still maintain civil liberties? And part of that is we're going to give them more authority, then let's make them even more responsible to make sure they safeguard the very things that they're trying to protect, which is personal liberty and freedom.
Well, tell us more about this dual use.
The dual use really started going back to the mid-'80s. There was some Department of Justice working groups that were looking at military technologies for use domestically, and by the late 80s, they had suggested to Department of Defense to have an open meeting to discuss ways of using some of these technologies, and they felt that the openness of the meeting was important so that people didn't become suspect that their government was doing something that was maybe against the popular interest. What happened is the opposite of what Department of Justice indicated they wanted, and it was actually a classified conference that took place sometime later with the Department of Defense. The hosts were Edward Teller and Janet Reno, although I think Reno was absent actually for at least the opening ceremonies of that meeting. But the agenda was released, and the agenda was quite disturbing because it included weapon systems of the most sophisticated nature, and the idea of using those domestically becomes a little bit disconcerting. Not just the surveillance side, but the idea that what are being posed as non-lethal, non-killing weapons, in fact, may inflict death on the individual subjected to exposure. Gas is a good example, one commonly known, but you know, a lot of people suffering from lung ailments and so on. There's been over 100 deaths related to what are thought to be harmless tear gas. in the past. And this is, again, things today are much more sophisticated than tear gas, and that's again where the public has been sort of left out of the loop, and yet these very systems are intended to be used domestically in the country.
What call would the government have to use such weapons against its own citizens?
Well, this is interesting. In the joint protocol between Department of Defense and Department of Justice, what they say is that any adversary, and they define adversaries pretty broadly, which includes in the definition anyone opposed to American policy. Now it should be disturbing to everyone, because that's basically everyone that walked in the streets in Seattle in protest of the WTO essentially were opposing American policy as it had been defined. And these people would be considered adversaries of the government. Now, in the past, it was called public debate and dissent, the right of assembly, the right to raise these kinds of questions and demand answers within this democratic process. And that's what's being neglected as they try and villainize average citizens, even to the point of investigative reporters, people who do serious research work. They're now giving us a new name, and it's called accumulators, and actually trying to villainize us by saying that because we gather data from the public domain, we don't deal with classified materials, that we somehow are some kind of a security risk. We don't believe that. The security of this country is rooted on the idea of a free and productive dialogue that leads to a good government, not a silent, afraid, fearful population.
So you've got dual-use weapons, you've got increased surveillance. Tell me about the means of surveillance. I know we're so used to it in commercial use. Go to Las Vegas and you know you're on 50 different cameras, but even go to your local store and you know that they've got cameras aimed at everybody in there. So we're getting kind of used to that, but this goes beyond commercial use. Go ahead.
Absolutely. The commercial side of surveillance has been around a long time, the government side as well, but what's happened is, I think the country to watch is Great Britain. It's sort of the leader in surveillance technology in terms of deployment all over the country. You can't drive through the channel or come in or out of Great Britain without a photographic image of your license plates and you as a person coming in and out. That information is, in terms of screening, one of the things that happens in Great Britain in high crime areas. Computers analyze the faces of individuals. They match those against criminal records, and then any potential felons, it's only got a 70% accuracy rate, but any potential felons or criminals are then zeroed in on by the computers that then alert technicians to really study the faces and see what the situation is. And they're using it as crime prevention. Some are actually monitoring actual conversations as well. And even in New York, they're talking about greater deployment of these kinds of systems in high crime areas. Again, it's sort of the first step in what eventually becomes very easy to survey entire urban centers. In fact, cameras for this purpose, they anticipate within the next few years, cameras down to 1/10 of an inch cubed will be available for this purpose, making them very cheap and easily used for even monitoring, in the case of the third world, all transportation corridors, urban settings, could be easily monitored for very little cost. And that's where the technology and the cost curves are kind of merging, because we're able to do more with our technology. The tendency is to do exactly that.
So the question comes up, if I'm just walking down the street, what do I care if a camera's showing that? Wouldn't that be better if certain untoward activities taking place, that they're able to catch the culprits and clean up society?
Well, I don't know. Maybe you're walking down the street and you're having a conversation with someone that's a rather private conversation, but maybe someone wants to record it and record it somewhere. Is that the kind of thing you want your government to do? The other question is, what if you're having a conversation with someone? You're a reporter in terms of reporting news. You meet a lot of different people in life, and then people start to draw conclusions because who you associate with. The fact is, being a totally scrutinized society is what the Soviet Union and China used to be all about.
Isn't that what we've been protesting for many decades here?
Absolutely. And this, when you go to Russia today, people are reluctant to even give their phone number for publication in a phone book, because they value their privacy, having not had any for so many years, to the point where they really recognize how even small things can turn into to abuses. And this is, again, our concern. When you start to villainize those very elements within your society and culture that cause the kind of public discussion and debate that have led to the kind of nation that we live in, we really have to ask ourselves, what is this war about if it's not about maintaining that right, that fundamental right as Americans to have that kind of dialogue and to be tolerant of dissenting opinions in a good and productive way. If we lose that, then we've lost the war. I don't care what countries fall in the interim. And that's really a lot of it. The surveillance side, you think back to the Super Bowl event where they finally announced face recognition systems to the mass population. Over a year before, we had published a great deal of material on this and how it would eventually be used in airports and transit stations and so on. And that's exactly what's happening today. It's just a little faster than we expected, but not unexpected.
Well, there's also the rise in commercial surveillance of our buying habits and our interests and all of that. Why? Because then we can be better consumers. We can be better targeted to be better consumers.
And this is, when you think about it, I mean, the amount of privacy used to be thought as sort of beginning and ending at your threshold of your house. Mm-hmm. And now privacy begins to a greater extent at the threshold of your digital life, that part of your life that's sitting and residing on computers all over the planet. And they're setting up what are called data warehouses, where essentially information is merged and collected. Now, with this event in New York, there's a big acceleration for collecting more and more seemingly unrelated data, so you can get profiles of individuals. I mean, if you can get their grocery list, and you get their medical records, and you can get their educational records and their telecommunications records and so on, you can get a pretty good visual view of who a person is and what they're about. And then if you really want to scrutinize them, with the new roving wiretaps and some of the new provisions in the law, it becomes very easy to monitor folks. And now with the ability to gain court orders and warrants without notifying the person that they're being searched till up to 90 days after the fact, if at all of that is creating a situation that Huxley predicted in his fiction Brave New World, and later amplified in his essay Brave New World Revisited that he wrote just a few years before he died. And it's about this directed and controlled society that exploits knowledge for the benefit of either commercial or political interest. And that is where the real abuse occurs.
What is some of the technological advancement to allow this to take place? How can they record the conversation when you're walking down the street?
Well, essentially, directional microphones and microphones in high crime areas is what's happening. In Great Britain, even in commercial enterprises, British Petroleum had over 1,000 petrol stations with not only visual cameras recording, but also the audio tracks being recorded as well. And most of us have this sort of assumption that when we're having a conversation with someone walking down the road, it's private. And, and this, again, sort of, because you have a conversation with someone that might be interpreted by someone else as not a good conversation to have, unless you've taken an action in furtherance of your comments. A lot of people say things, every one of us say things that maybe we wish we hadn't said. Is that going to be held against us in the future? Is that going to be every word that we utter is going to create an investigation of who we might be and what we might be about? To live in that kind of society is pretty oppressive. I think everyone would agree that that's not the kind of society that we want to see our children raised in or that we want to live in.